But such a supportive family member here contributing a buck to the performance. So, but I won't worry about him. I hope the rest of you enjoy it. I was a freshman at the University of Maine and will always remember when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. My roommates and I were listening to music on the radio while studying, and the program was interrupted with the announcement. We were a lot like the kids today and had not been following the international news that closely, and it came as a complete surprise. In early 1942, I, along with several other students, enlisted in the Army Air Corps, but were not called to service until February of 1943. We were sent to Atlantic City, New Jersey for a month of basic training, where we stayed in the Marlboro Blenheim Hotel, marched up and down the freezing boardwalk and to the rifle range for about 10 miles outside the city for our ground school. At that time, the Air Force was growing faster than the training facilities and the airplanes were being produced. We were then sent for 2 months to Syracuse University for additional training, and finally on June 2nd, transferred to San Antonio, Texas to start our training. Shortly after getting there, I tore the cartilage in my right knee, which could have been the end of my Air Force career, because there was a surgeon there who believed that the only cure was surgery, and several of his patients were no longer able to walk. But just before I was scheduled for surgery, he was transferred and the new treatment was exercises. Soon I was back on track and went to Waco, Texas to start my primary training. For the next 11 months, we were trained in PT-19, PT-13 single-engine planes, and AT-17 twin-engine planes. In May of 1944, we were commissioned as second lieutenants and got a pay raise from $75 to $225 a month. I was one of those selected for B-24 training. You can pass this picture. People that are not familiar with it, but this is the B-24. There were 17,000 B-24s made during World War II, more than any other aircraft. Now there's only one completely equipped B-24, which was the one that visited Worcester here several weeks ago. The design of the consolidated B-24 was only completed in December of 1939, but immediately put in production at the San Diego plant in 1940. Then in 1941, production started at a new consolidated plant in Fort Worth, also at Douglas Aircraft, and in Tulsa, Ford Aircraft in Will Run, in North American in Dallas. Because of the urgent need of the planes, they were delivered with very, very little testing, and many accidents occurred. After Fort Worth, we went to Lincoln, Nebraska to pick up our co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and radio operators for another month of training before getting other 5 crew members and going to Tucson, Arizona for 3 months more of training and transfer to Hamilton Field, California to await shipment overseas. Here are a couple of pictures of our crew. One of them shows us as we were dressed for with our flying jackets. This is where we were dressed for missions, even though we were located only 2 degrees from the equator. The temperature at 30,000 feet was close to freezing, and we had no heat in the plane. The other was the way we were dressed on the ground. On January 17, 1945, we arrived at Nadzab, New Guinea for final training, and on April 15 were transferred, and arrived at our base in Maritime. This is a small island in the Halmahera chain of the Netherlands East Indies, just about 2 degrees north of the equator. The island was about 40 miles long and 20 miles wide. Only a dense forest separated us from some of the remnants of the Japanese army were on the island. Here we joined the 372nd Squadron of the 307th Group of the 13th Air Force, the little Air Force, which is doing a big arm. We were known as the Long Rangers because we were flying missions 10 to 15 hours long, the longest missions flown by any B-24 group in the world. We flew 36 missions, striking Borneo airports, refineries, and the oil field, as well as missions to the Philippines, convoy covers, and shipping schedule. Here is a final photograph showing the bombing of an airfield in Borneo. Notice the yellow circled area, which was where the bombs hit in the middle of the runway and completely destroyed it. Incidentally, think about a bombardier at 30,000 feet checking out through a bomb site and hitting that runway right smack down through the middle. Typically, we rose at 2 a.m. for breakfast, mission briefing, and transit to the airport strip for takeoff at about 5 a.m. In order to be able to fly the long missions, we had to overload our planes. The planes were certified to take off with a maximum gross weight of 64,000 pounds with 2,200 gallons of fuel and 800 pounds of bomb. We took off with 72,000 pounds and 3,000 gallons of fuel. When doing this, we barely gained altitude in flying speed of 100 feet above the ground by the time we reached the end of the runway. Then, after very slowly climbing to 500 feet, we had to fly over the ocean at this altitude for 4 to 5 hours before we had burned off enough fuel to be able to climb to our 30,000 feet bombing altitude. Needless to say, if something happened then, you bought the bomb. Except for an hour or two at night, when a navigator could use celestial navigation, we had to rely completely on dead reckoning and one-dimensional sunshots. There were no radio navigation systems available at all. There were never more than 8 planes in our group for a mission. We flew alone until we reached the rendezvous point where we joined the other aircraft for the bomb run. We made one circular path to get in formation, made our bomb run, and broke from the squadron for our trip home. The only time we used our radios was in an emergency or when we were 30 minutes from our base on the way home. Enemy flak and our long flights were our biggest hazards. At one time, we had a visiting general who wanted to lead our mission. When we approached the rendezvous altitude, he came on the radio and told us all to join the formation at 31,000 feet. Needless to say, we all scattered quickly to find a new altitude and made our own individual bomb runs. Strangely, we were never reprimanded for disobeying this order. Because of our very critical fuel situation, we made dead stick power landings. We approached the field at an altitude of 500 feet until we reached a point where we could glide to a landing without using power. If we should run out of fuel, we could land safely. Needless to say, a 60,000-pound B-24 with no power fell almost like a rock. This type of landing also meant, though, that we would leave the runway free of turbulence so another aircraft could land right behind us. Often there were 3 planes on the runway at the same time. One was touching down, one in the middle of the runway, and one on the end of the runway turning off. There was a time when one plane turned off at the end of the runway, and all 4 engines stopped because they had run out of gas. After each mission, we were debriefed, given a 2-ounce shot of whiskey, a dinner of fried, boiled, baked, or breaded spam, with dehydrated potatoes, dehydrated coffee, and were in bed by 10 p.m. Then 2 days off before our next mission. We did not have enough planes for each crew to have their own, and the planes flew every day, which put a great burden on our ground crews, many who had had no leaves at all for 5 years. Frequently, I also made test flights on aircraft that had been repaired. On one of our missions, we lost an engine. When this happened, we had to do everything to lighten the plane, including jettisoning waste guns and any other equipment, and all personal equipment, including handguns. During one of our reunions, 2 of our enlisted men told of how they had been harassed by the government after getting out of the service for stealing their revolvers, which they had thrown overboard. Also, at the same reunion, the tail gunner claimed that on one mission we lost 2 engines, not one. And he said, in all these years, he said, I had the faith that you knew what the hell was going up there on the flight deck, and you didn't even know how many engines were turning. We were much more fortunate, however, than those who had to fight from the ground. We lived in tents with platforms, and although we had a sparse diet of powdered milk, dehydrated potatoes, spam, dehydrated carrots, dehydrated oranges, we did have clean beds to sleep every night, crewed officers, and enlistment clubs. I even built a 7-sided poker table from ammunition boxes. The training I had as a Boy Scout often helped me to adapt to the primitive conditions. There was a small Navy base also, and frequently ships stopped for 2 or 3 weeks refueling. One was the Rocky Mount, a flagship, and some of the officers learned about our tennis court and showed up one day to play. To reciprocate it, they invited me and my navigator to join them for a Sunday dinner on their ship. Since the only way we had to press our uniforms was to put them under our mattresses, and the results were not the greatest. When we joined them for dinner, we felt like poor cousins because they were all in their best, perfectly dressed uniforms. However, we did enjoy a full course meal and dessert. Our medical facilities left something to be desired, though. I had a hemorrhoid operation where, to perform the operation, I had to bend over and grab my ankles while the operation was in process, and then walk back to my tent and fly the next day. Several years later, when being examined for another hemorrhoid by a doctor here, he said it looked like a dentist must have done the first job. On June 5th, 1945, I was promoted to first lieutenant and awarded the Air Medal. I must have dropped it here someplace. I'll have to look around for it.
We'll sell it.
When WWII was announced on August 14th, the crew who had just arrived went, we'll look for it afterwards. When WWII was announced to us on August 14th, the crew who just arrived went wild with celebration. But the other men who had been there for some time were very subdued because they were having a lot of trouble believing that the war was really over. Shortly before the end of the war, I met a class of mine from the University of Maine who was in another group on Maritime. We frequently got together, but just before I left the island, I went to see him again, only to learn that he and his crew had made a forced landing in the ocean and was thought to have perished. We both had camps on Long Pond and Rangeley, Maine, and it wasn't until 3 months later, when I was visiting with one of the natives on the pond, that I learned that the crew spent 10 days in the life raft before picking up by a friendly submarine that for no reason had decided to surface only to see the life raft nearby and pick them up. Because we were in a malaria zone, we were required to take Atibrin every day to suppress malaria. This made our skin yellow. And incidentally, if we got malaria, immediately our flight pay stopped. So we had to take a real incentive to take malaria. I never knew that I had malaria until I returned home and to college at the University of Maine. Got sick and lost consciousness. Fortunately, there was a staff doctor who had also just returned. He recognized the symptoms and was able to recommend the treatment. When we returned home, we were all very happy to learn about the GI Bill of Rights had been passed by a grateful Congress, and over half of the 15 million veterans took advantage of its benefits. Many of them went on to college. Most of us did not think much about our experience or talk much about our experience to friends or relatives, and they hesitated to ask about our experience, thinking that we did not want to talk about them. In most cases, this really was not the case. It lasted for years. We just came home, wanted to pick up our lives as quickly as we could. That's my...
Looking at the bomber picture that went around here with the props, I can't help thinking back when I was in the Army myself. They shipped us all back from France to California in a 4-engine prop troop transport. This was the hottest ride in a plane I ever had. The vibration, the noise from these props came back to me when I saw that picture. Also, the dates that you mentioned were in the early 40s, when I was wearing diapers, brought me back to the book that I read, and I'm sure you wrote it, you read it, and I'm sure some other people in this group have read the book called Unbroken. If you haven't read it, you should read it. One comment, and I think Steve made the comment, there was one book you just can't put down once you get into it. I don't know if you've read it or not, but it's all about what you've just talked about. I have. And to recall the book on how cramped and hard the spaces were inside those bombers. No room to move, claustrophobic, noisy, cold. I don't frankly know how you put up with it, but you did. Thank you.
Well, they were very noisy. This is why I got the hearing aid, okay? Because I lost a considerable amount of hearing aid, and it was cramped. And I got to tell you one interesting sidelight to this. I don't know how many saw the B-24 when it was here in Worcester a couple of weeks ago, but if you haven't, one of the funny things was, and my wife saw this plane, and she said, "I thought you said it was a big plane." Well, so then it was. But the other thing that was funny, there was one of the crew members and he was going through the plane, and he had an awful time walking from the tail through the bomb bay. because he added a little bit of weight along the way, and he was telling everybody how he ran back and forth with Bombay, and he could barely get through.
Wow.
Yeah,
Needless to say, it was a very, very happy dog.
okay.
I think you'll all join me in this Veterans Day weekend in thanking Ed for his service in World War II and the service of all the men and women who are now in the armed forces who have been. Thank you all. We'll see you next week.